At minus 15 degrees, heat isn't comfort, it's survival. The first thing I noticed wasn't the silence. It was the absence of it. The way the house stopped breathing. No low hum from the furnace. No soft click of the vents expanding. Just this dead, hollow stillness that made the walls feel thinner, like the cold was already inside before I even checked the thermostat. 47 degrees and dropping, and I could see my breath hanging in the air like smoke as I exhaled, slow and steady, trying to convince myself it was just a glitch, just a breaker, just something small. But then the pipes answered for me with that sharp, brittle tick from inside the walls. The kind of sound you don't forget once you've heard it. The kind that means water is turning solid. That metal is starting to give. That time is running out. And that's when I knew this wasn't an accident. Because the timing was too perfect. Coldest night of the year, wind slicing through the siding like a blade. The kind of cold that makes your fingers ache before you even step outside. And somehow my heat just stopped. I pulled on my jacket, boots crunching against the hardwood as frost crept along the inside edges of the windows. And when I opened the front door, the air hit me like a wall, dry and sharp, stealing the warmth from my lungs in one breath. And the entire street looked normal, porch lights glowing, snow untouched. Every other house quietly holding its heat like nothing had changed, except mine. I walked straight to the meter, the metal cold enough to sting. Through my gloves, and there it was, the valve turned, clean, deliberate, not broken, not frozen, turned off. Someone had done this, someone with access, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And as I stood there, staring at that small, simple handle, I could already feel the temperature inside dropping further. Already picture the pipes bursting, the walls swelling, the kind of damage that doesn't just cost money. It erases everything, the smell of old wood, the marks on the doorway. My dad carved when I was a kid. The furnace he installed himself 30 years ago still bolted into the basement floor like it belonged there, like it was part of the house, part of us, and now someone had decided they could just shut it off like flipping a switch. I didn't need a note to know who. I'd seen the letters, the warnings, the neat little envelopes stamped with HOA insignia talking about unauthorized modifications and noncompliance. Words that sound polite until you realize they're just dressed-up threats. And Maggie Holloway had that voice, the kind that smiles while it corners you, the kind that tells you it's for your own good while it takes something you can't afford to lose. I could almost hear her already, explaining how it was a safety measure, how the community standards had to be maintained, how rules are rules, even when the temperature outside could kill a man in a few hours. And I stood there in that frozen silence, the wind cutting across the street, the metal valve still under my hand, and I felt something shift, not anger, not yet, something colder, something precise, because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the system they thought they controlled wasn't just pipes and meters and paperwork. It was a network, and I knew every inch of it, every junction, every failsafe, every emergency override built into the grid beneath their perfect little neighborhood. I'd helped design parts of it years ago, back when it was just lines on paper and calculations on a screen, and as the cold crept deeper into my house behind me, as the last bit of trapped warmth faded into the night, I realized something simple and absolute. They hadn't just shut off my heat. They had handed me the one thing they should have never given me, a reason to use the system the way it was never meant to be used. I did not go back inside right away, because once you step into a house that is losing heat, you feel it faster, like the walls are closing in with cold instead of space. So I stayed there at the meter for another second, forcing myself to slow down, to think, because panic is what breaks systems, and I have spent most of my life making sure systems do not break. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 38 years old, and for the past 15 years I have worked in heating, ventilation, and gas infrastructure, the kind of work most people never notice until something goes wrong. I design load balances, emergency shutoffs, distribution paths, the invisible arteries that keep homes livable when winter decides to remind you who is in charge. In this neighborhood, every line under it, every pressure regulator, every backup valve. I know it like a map burned into my head, because I helped upgrade part of this grid 6 years ago when the county expanded the subdivision. I remember standing in frozen dirt back then, boots sinking into mud that turned to ice overnight, watching crews weld sections of pipe together while I checked pressure tolerances on a tablet that barely worked in the cold. I remember signing off on the emergency override systems, The redundancies designed to protect families when something failed, because heat is not optional in places where winter drops below zero. It is the difference between comfort and damage, between inconvenience and disaster. And I built those safeguards with one assumption, that they would be used to protect people, not to control them. My house sits at the edge of the development, older than most of the properties around it. Built by my father when land was still cheap and regulations were still reasonable. He was not an engineer, but he understood systems in his own way, believed in doing things right the first time. I can still see him in the basement, sleeves rolled up, installing the original furnace with hands that knew every tool without looking, the smell of metal and dust hanging in the air while he explained why heat had to be reliable, why you never cut corners on something that keeps a house alive in winter. When he passed, the house became more than just walls and wiring. It became proof of everything he built, everything he stood for. And I kept it running the way he would have wanted, upgraded the system, reinforced the lines, made sure every connection was solid, every safety measure in place. Which is exactly why Maggie had a problem with it. She did not like anything she did. Not control, and my system did not belong to her. It did not follow the simplified templates the HOA preferred. It was efficient, legal, inspected, but independent, and independence is something people like her see as a threat. The first notice came 3 months after she took over as president, a clean white envelope with language that sounded polite. Until you read it twice, unauthorized modification, review required, compliance pending. I remember standing in my kitchen with that paper in my hand, coffee going cold on the counter while the heater hummed steadily behind me, thinking it was just another formality, something I could clear up with documentation. I sent everything, permits, inspection reports, system diagrams. The kind of detail that usually ends a conversation before it starts. But with Maggie, it only made things worse. Because facts do not matter to someone who already decided the outcome. She started showing up in person after that, always with that same controlled smile, clipboard in hand like it gave her authority over physics itself, talking about community standards, about consistency, about how every home needed to align with the association guidelines. And I told her the truth, calmly, professionally, that my system exceeded every safety requirement, that it was designed to be more resilient than the standard setups she was pushing, that it was not her jurisdiction to dictate internal infrastructure as long as it passed code. And that was the moment I saw it, the shift in her expression, the way her smile tightened just enough to show this was no longer about rules. It was about control, and from that point on, every letter got sharper, every visit colder, until tonight, standing outside in subzero air, staring at a valve someone had deliberately turned, I understood something my father tried to teach me years ago. Systems are not dangerous because they fail, they are dangerous because of who is allowed to touch them. And Maggie Holloway had just crossed a line she could not even see, because she thought this was about enforcing rules. But for me, this was something else entirely. This was about survival, and I do not lose when survival is on the line. The first time I really saw Maggie Holloway up close, she was standing in the middle of my driveway like she owned the ground beneath her feet, heels planted perfectly on the concrete my father poured himself, clipboard tucked under one arm, white SUV idling behind her with the engine humming low and steady like it was part of her presence. And even then, before any of this escalated, there was something about the way she looked at my house that told me she did not see it as a home. She saw it as a problem waiting to be corrected. She was in her early 50s, always dressed like she had somewhere more important to be, tailored coat, spotless boots, hair set with that kind of precision that does not move even in the wind, and she spoke in that calm, measured tone that never rises but somehow still manages to press down on you, like every word is already decided before you respond. She introduced herself like a formality, president of the Homeowners Association, as if the title itself should answer any question I might have. And when she talked about the neighborhood, she did not say people. She said properties, values, standards, everything framed like a system she was responsible for maintaining, not a community she was part of. And that was the first sign. Because people who talk like that are not interested in balance. They are interested in control. I remember the smell of her perfume mixing with the faint exhaust from her car, sharp and expensive. Something that did not belong in a place where most of us still fix things ourselves. And as she walked around the side of my house without asking, heels clicking against the concrete, She stopped near the external line I had reinforced the year before, the upgraded regulator housing, the insulated casing I installed to prevent freeze issues during extreme weather. She tapped it lightly with the edge of her pen like she was inspecting a flaw. And then she smiled, that tight, controlled smile that never quite reaches the eyes, and said it did not match the community aesthetic. I actually thought she was joking at first, because no one who understands infrastructure would ever reduce it to aesthetics. But she was serious, completely serious, and when I explained the function, the safety advantages, the compliance with every city and county code, she listened just long enough to confirm she did not care, because what she said next had nothing to do with engineering. She said the board prefers uniform systems, easier to manage, easier to regulate, easier to enforce. And there it was, the real priority, not safety, not efficiency, control. She wanted everything simplified so it could be governed without resistance, and anything outside that model became a target. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing patterns, not just with me, but across the neighborhood. Small things at first, letters about mailbox colors, warnings about fence heights, fines for things that had never been enforced before, and always the same tone, polite on the surface, but rigid underneath, like a system tightening around people who did not even realize it was happening. I talked to a few neighbors, quietly, nothing formal, just conversations over driveways and sidewalks, and they all had the same look, that mix of frustration and resignation, like they knew something was off, but did not want to push back hard enough to find out how far it would go. And that is how authority like hers grows, not through force, but through slow, consistent pressure, until people adjust their lives to avoid conflict, until compliance becomes habit, and habit becomes control. But what Maggie never understood was that infrastructure does not respond to authority the way people do. Pipes do not care about titles. Systems do not recognize influence. They follow physics, pressure, flow, temperature, rules that cannot be rewritten with a vote or a letter. And standing there that night, with the cold biting through my jacket and the valve still turned against me, I realized she had made a mistake that no amount of paperwork could fix, because she stepped out of her world of controlled appearances and into mine. And in my world, control is not something you declare, it is something you understand, something you earn, and something you can lose the second you underestimate the system you are trying to command. I turned the valve back on slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I needed to feel it, the resistance in the metal, the exact point where pressure would return to the line. And when I did, there was no immediate sound, no comforting rush of gas through pipes, just that same dead quiet hanging in the air like the system itself was deciding whether to respond. And then, a few seconds later, a faint tremor through the line, a low, almost hesitant vibration that told me flow had resumed. But it was not enough, not yet. Because restarting a system in this kind of cold is not like flipping a switch. It is a process. Pressure equalizes slowly, regulators adjust, furnaces cycle back on one by one, and every second matters when the temperature inside is already dropping below safe levels. I stepped back inside and the cold hit differently now, sharper, deeper, like it had settled into the structure itself. The hardwood under my boots felt stiff, the air dry and thin, and the thermostat had fallen to 41 degrees. I could see the condensation on the inside of the windows turning to frost along the edges, creeping inward like it had time on its side. I moved straight to the basement, down the narrow steps my father built, the familiar creak under my weight sounding louder in the silence. And when I reached the furnace, I rested my hand on the metal casing. Cold, too cold. The pilot system had not reignited yet, which meant I had a window, a small one, to bring everything back online before damage set in. I ran through the sequence in my head automatically, checking the intake, clearing the ignition cycle, adjusting the regulator feed manually to stabilize pressure, every movement deliberate, controlled, because rushing this is how systems fail completely. And as I worked, I could hear it, faint at first, then building, that low hum returning to life, the sound of the furnace pulling in fuel, igniting, pushing heat back into the ducts. And when the first wave of warm air finally pushed through the vent above me, it felt less like comfort and more like survival clawing its way back into the house. I stood there for a second longer than I needed to, letting that sound settle, letting the system stabilize. But even as the heat returned, something else stayed with me, something colder than the air had been minutes ago, Because this was not a failure. This was not weather. This was a decision. Someone had walked up to that meter and turned it off knowing exactly what would happen next, knowing what this kind of cold does to a house, to a person, and they expected me to just accept it, to call, to complain, to wait for permission to fix what they broke. I went back upstairs and grabbed the envelope still sitting on my kitchen counter, the latest. Notice from the association, the paper stiff in my hand, the language precise and detached, violation of community infrastructure standards, pending corrective action, and right there at the bottom, the line that mattered, authorization granted for intervention if compliance is not achieved. They had written it in clean, careful words. But the meaning was simple. They believed they had the authority to touch my system, to interfere with something that was never theirs to control. I set the paper down and looked out the window. The street still calm, still quiet, every house lit, every system running, because no one else had been singled out tonight. This was targeted, deliberate, and as the heat slowly climbed back inside my home, I realized something that shifted everything into focus. This was not just about enforcement. This was a test, a way to see how far they could push, how much control they could exert without resistance. And if I responded the way they expected, if I treated this like a mistake or a misunderstanding, it would not stop here. It would escalate, because systems like hers do not retreat, they expand. And standing there with the warmth returning around me, I understood that this was the moment where the line had to be drawn, not with words, not with complaints, but with something she could not ignore, because Maggie Holloway had just proven she was willing to use infrastructure as leverage, and what she still did not understand was that she had just stepped into a system where leverage works both ways. I did what anyone would expect first. I reached for the phone instead of the system, because there is still a part of you that believes problems like this can be solved the normal way, that someone on the other end of the line will hear what happened and fix it. So I called the gas company, stood there in my kitchen with the heat slowly climbing back through the vents, listening to the automated prompts while the clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have, each second carrying the weight of what almost happened. When I finally got through to a real person, I kept it simple, professional, explained that my service had been manually shut off at the meter, that I had restored it, that I needed confirmation no authorized technician had been dispatched, and there was a pause on the other end, the kind that tells you the answer is already not what you want to hear. The representative checked the account, verified the address, and then said it clearly: no service order, no technician, no authorized interruption, which meant exactly what I already knew. This did not come from them. This came from someone else. I thanked her, ended the call, and stared at the phone for a second longer than necessary, because now the path was narrowing. Next step, HOA. I dialed the number listed on the notice, the one Maggie had personally underlined in one of her earlier letters, and it rang twice before going to a voicemail system that sounded too polished to be accidental, her voice, calm, composed, reminding residents to leave detailed messages regarding compliance issues. I almost laughed at that word, compliance, after what just happened, but I left the message anyway, stated my name, my address, described exactly what had occurred, including the unauthorized shutdown of my gas supply in subzero conditions, and I made sure my tone stayed even, controlled, because I wanted it on record, not as an argument, but as evidence. When I hung up, I expected something, a call back, a response, any sign that this was being handled. But nothing came. Minutes passed, then an hour. The heat stabilized inside my house, but the silence from her side did not change, and that silence told me more than any explanation could have. This was not a mistake they were rushing to fix. This was something they were comfortable ignoring. I pulled up the HOA bylaws on my laptop, the same documents they liked to quote whenever it suited them, scrolled through pages of language about maintenance, aesthetics, shared responsibilities, and buried in all of it was exactly what I expected: nothing, no clause granting them authority to interfere with individual gas service, no provision allowing them to manipulate utility access at the meter level, which meant everything they did tonight existed outside their own rules, outside the system they claimed to enforce. And that should have been enough. It should have been a clear line. But systems like hers do not operate on clarity. They operate on assumption, on the idea that no one will challenge them deeply enough to expose the gap between what they claim and what they are allowed to do. I opened my email next, half expecting some follow-up notice, some attempt to justify the action after the fact, And there it was, time-stamped less than 20 minutes after I left that voicemail. A new message from the association, subject line marked urgent compliance. Update. I clicked it open and read it once, then again, slower, because the wording mattered. Due to ongoing infrastructure concerns, temporary service interruptions may be implemented to ensure community safety. Temporary, safety, carefully chosen words designed to make something extreme sound reasonable. But there was no acknowledgement of what had already been done, no apology, no correction, just a statement positioned as policy. And that was the moment the normal route ended, because I had followed the steps, made the calls, checked the rules, and every path led back to the same place. A system that believed it could act without consequence. And as I closed the laptop and looked around my house, now slowly warming back to life, I understood something with absolute clarity. If I kept treating this like a problem to report, I would stay exactly where they wanted me, reacting, waiting, asking for permission. And that was never going to stop what had already started. The next morning did not feel like a reset. It felt like a continuation, like the night had not really ended but just shifted into a different kind of pressure, the kind that sits under everything you do. I woke up before the alarm. The house finally stable at 68 degrees, but the air still carried that dry edge from the night before, a reminder that systems do not forget stress immediately. They recover slowly, carefully, and I moved through the house the same way, checking vents, listening to the steady hum of the furnace, making sure nothing had cracked, nothing had failed in the hours where it mattered most, because damage from cold does not always show itself right away. Sometimes it waits, builds, then surfaces when you think everything is fine. And as I stood there in the kitchen with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the steam rise instead of freeze, I kept replaying the sequence in my head, the valve, the silence, the email, all of it fitting together too cleanly to ignore. This was not just escalation, this was strategy, and that realization changed the way I looked at everything around me. I stepped outside and the cold was still sharp, but manageable now that the sun had pushed a faint light across the neighborhood, the kind of pale winter morning where everything looks calm on the surface, but underneath, the system is still under strain. I walked along the edge of my property, boots crunching through thin ice, and I started noticing things I had not paid attention to before. Small utility markers near the curb, regulator housings at the corners of certain lots, subtle variations in the way the gas lines were distributed across the development. Details most people never see because they do not need to, but to me they stood out immediately, because they formed a pattern, a network, and I realized something important. This neighborhood was not just a collection of individual homes. It was a connected system, one that relied on shared pressure points, shared control nodes, and shared dependencies, which meant what happened to one part could influence others if you understood how the flow was structured. I walked further down the street, past houses that looked identical at a glance, but were not identical underneath. Each one tied into the same main distribution loop, each one dependent on regulators that balanced supply across the entire grid. And as I mapped it out in my head, I could see exactly where those balances shifted, where pressure could be redirected, where the system compensated automatically when something changed. And that was when the full picture came into focus. Maggie thought she had isolated me, treated my house like a single unit she could control without consequence. But the reality was the opposite. Nothing in this system existed in isolation. Everything was connected. Everything responded to changes whether people realized it or not. I stopped near one of the main regulator points, a metal box partially covered in frost, and I crouched down, brushing away a thin layer of ice to reveal the access panel, not touching it, just looking, just confirming what I already knew. This was one of the nodes that balanced supply to a section of the neighborhood, one of the points where pressure adjustments could ripple outward if triggered under the right conditions. And I stood back up slowly, the cold air biting at my face, but my mind was no longer on the temperature. It was on the structure, the logic of the system, the way it could be influenced without breaking rules, without stepping outside the boundaries of what was technically allowed, because that was the difference between reaction and response, between anger and precision. Maggie had used a simple action, turning a valve, thinking it only affected one house, but she had no understanding of the broader system she was interfering with, no awareness of how interconnected everything was, and that lack of understanding was not just a weakness, it was an opening. I walked back toward my house, slower this time, not because I was unsure, but because I was thinking through every step, every possibility, every constraint. Because if I was going to respond, it could not be impulsive. It had to be exact. It had to expose the flaw in her assumption without crossing into anything that could be turned against me. And as I reached my driveway, the house standing solid and warm behind me, I realized something that settled everything into place. This was no longer about proving her wrong. It was about showing her the system she thought she controlled. And in a system like this, control is never what it seems on the surface. By the time I got back inside, the plan was not a plan yet. It was just a pattern forming in the back of my mind. Something incomplete but impossible to ignore. The kind of realization that does not arrive all at once but builds piece by piece until it becomes clear enough that you cannot unsee it. I set my gloves on the counter, the fabric still stiff from the cold, and walked straight to the small office space near the back of the house where I kept my old project files. Not because I needed confirmation, but because I wanted precision, because in systems like this, guessing is how you lose control, and I do not guess. I opened the drawer and pulled out the folder I had not touched in years, the original distribution plans for this neighborhood expansion, printed on heavy paper with notes in the margins that only I would recognize: pressure thresholds, regulator tolerances, emergency routing paths. All of it laid out in clean lines that looked simple until you understood what they meant. I spread the pages across the desk and leaned over them, tracing the main line with my finger, following it from the primary feed near the road all the way through the branching loops that fed each section of the neighborhood. And there it was again, the same realization from outside, but clearer now, sharper. The system was not just connected. It was balanced, designed to maintain stability by distributing load across multiple nodes, which meant if one part shifted, the rest compensated automatically. Not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice, but enough that someone who understood the system could predict exactly how it would respond. I sat down and let that settle. The hum of the furnace steady behind me now, the house warm again. But my focus was not on comfort anymore. It was on structure, because what Maggie had done the night before was not just an overreach. It was a misunderstanding of how control actually works in a network like this. She believed she could isolate my house, treat it like a single point she could manipulate without affecting anything else. But that assumption only holds if the system is truly independent. And this one was not. Every line fed into a shared pressure loop. Every regulator adjusted based on demand across multiple homes, which meant any change at a key point could ripple outward in ways that were technically normal, technically within operational parameters, but noticeable when conditions were already strained. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a second, not because I was uncertain, but because I was measuring the line between possibility and consequence, because there is always a line. And crossing it without understanding what comes next is how you turn a response into a mistake. I reached for my laptop and pulled up the current weather forecast, the numbers confirming what I already felt in the air: another cold front moving in, temperatures expected to drop even lower over the next 48 hours, sustained sub-zero conditions that would push the system to its limits, the exact kind of environment where pressure balancing becomes critical, where even small shifts can be felt across multiple homes. And that was when the final piece clicked into place, not as an impulse, not as anger, but as a clear, calculated understanding of cause and effect. Maggie had chosen her moment based on vulnerability, using the cold as leverage because she knew it increased pressure on me. But that same pressure applied to the entire system, not just one house. And if the system responded to changes the way it was designed to, then the right adjustment, at the right point, under the right conditions, would not break anything, would not violate any operational rule, but it would make one thing very clear: that control in a network like this is never one-directional. I closed the laptop slowly and looked back down at the plans spread across the desk, every line, every node, every connection mapped out in front of me. And for the first time since the night before, everything felt quiet again, not because the situation had resolved, but because I understood it completely now. There were no unknowns left, no gaps in the system I needed to figure out, just a series of steps that needed to be timed correctly. And as I gathered the papers back into the folder, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else so far. This was no longer about reacting to what she did. This was about showing her exactly what she had interfered with, not through words, not through complaints, but through the system itself, because systems do not argue, they demonstrate. And when they do, there is no room left for interpretation. I did not rush into anything after that, because once you understand a system, the worst thing you can do is act too fast. So I slowed everything down, made it deliberate, methodical. I started documenting, not because I needed proof for myself, but because systems like hers rely on the absence of records, on the idea that actions happen quietly and get forgotten. I went back outside with my phone and took clear photos of the meter, the valve position, the frost pattern around the fitting that showed it had been manually turned recently. Small details most people would overlook, but that tell a complete story if you know what you are looking at. I recorded the timestamp, the temperature reading from my own outdoor sensor, -15 degrees at the exact moment the service had been cut. Then I went back inside and pulled the furnace logs from my control system, digital records that tracked ignition failure, pressure drops, restart cycles, every second of what the system experienced during that shutdown. And I saved everything, backed it up, labeled it carefully, because evidence is not just about what happened. It is about how clearly you can show it later. I printed the HOA email as well, the one that tried to frame the interruption as a safety measure, and placed it next to the logs on my desk, lining up their language with the actual sequence of events. And the contradiction was obvious. They claimed temporary adjustment, but the system recorded a full shutdown. They implied oversight, but there was no authorization anywhere outside their own statement. And that gap, that space between what they said and what actually happened, that was where the entire structure of their authority started to break down. I sat there for a moment, looking at everything laid out in front of me, the papers, the data, the photos, and I realized something important. This was not just about proving wrongdoing. This was about understanding exactly how far they had gone, and more importantly, how far they thought they could go without being challenged. I opened my laptop again and accessed the county utility records. Public data most people never think to check, but it contains the backbone of everything. Permits, infrastructure classifications, maintenance responsibilities. And I searched for the specific section covering this neighborhood, scrolling through documents until I found the designation that mattered: privately managed distribution with regulated oversight, which meant the HOA had administrative influence over certain aspects of maintenance, but not operational control over individual service points. That authority remained strictly defined, strictly limited. And what Maggie had done the night before stepped outside that boundary completely, not in a subtle way, not in a gray area, but clearly, directly. And that clarity was what made the next part possible. Because when you understand exactly where the rules end, you also understand exactly where your own options begin. I leaned back in the chair again, letting that settle, the quiet hum of the house steady around me now. The warmth no longer something I had to think about, but the memory of that cold still sharp enough to keep everything focused. This was not about reacting emotionally, not about getting even in some reckless way. This was about response within the system, using the same structure she relied on, but with an understanding she did not have, because she believed control came from position, from titles, from documents. But control in a network like this comes from knowledge, from knowing how pressure moves, how demand shifts, how systems compensate when pushed in specific ways. I gathered the documents into a single folder and set them aside, not because I was done, but because I had everything I needed now: the facts, the proof, the structure, all aligned. And as I stood up and walked back toward the window, looking out at the neighborhood that still seemed calm on the surface, I realized the situation had moved past uncertainty entirely. There was no question left about what had happened, no doubt about the boundaries that had been crossed, just a clear understanding of cause and effect. And in a system built on cause and effect, the response does not need to be loud, it just needs to be precise, because once it starts, everything else follows exactly the way it was designed to. I did not call a lawyer first, and I did not call the city again, because both of those paths take time, and time was something Maggie had already shown she was willing to use against me. Instead, I reached out to someone who understood systems the same way I did, someone who would not look at this as a complaint but as a pattern. His name is Daniel Reeves. We worked together years ago on municipal distribution projects, the kind of jobs where mistakes do not just cost money, they ripple through entire communities. And if there is one thing Daniel does not tolerate, It is people interfering with infrastructure they do not understand. He picked up on the second ring, his voice the same as I remembered, steady, direct, no wasted words. And I explained it to him exactly as it happened. No exaggeration, no emotion, just sequence, the shutdown, the temperature, the lack of authorization, the HOA email, and there was a pause on his end, not confusion, not surprise, just the kind of silence. That means he is already processing the implications. When he spoke again, his tone shifted slightly. More focused, he asked one question first, simple but critical. Did they touch the meter or the regulator? And I told him the truth. The meter valve, manual shutoff. And he let out a quiet breath that carried more weight than any reaction. Because that answer changed everything. He explained it clearly, not because I needed the explanation, but because hearing it out loud matters. Touching a meter without authorization is not just overreach. It crosses into regulated territory. It creates liability, not just for damage, but for interference with controlled infrastructure. And in conditions like that, subzero, it escalates the severity, not emotionally, but technically, because the risk profile changes, systems behave differently under stress, and actions that might be minor in mild conditions become critical when the margin for error disappears. I listened, letting him confirm what I already knew, but also adding something I had not fully considered yet. Documentation is not just protection. It is leverage when the system is used correctly. He asked if I had records, and I told him yes. Everything, timestamps, logs, photos, and he said good. Keep it organized, keep it clean, because if this moves forward, clarity matters more than anything else. But then he asked something else, something that shifted the conversation slightly. He asked if I had considered how the system would respond if pressure balancing was disrupted during peak demand, not as a suggestion, not as advice, but as a question. And I did not answer right away, because I already had. I had been thinking about it since the moment I saw the layout again. But hearing it from him confirmed that I was not the only one seeing the same pattern. He did not tell me what to do, and I did not ask, because that is not how conversations like this work. Instead, he reminded me of something we both understood from years of working in these systems. Everything operates within defined limits, but those limits are not always obvious to the people relying on them. And when those limits are approached, the system reveals its structure very quickly. I thanked him, ended the call, and set the phone down. The room quiet again except for the steady operation of the house around me. And I stood there for a moment, letting everything align, the evidence on the desk, the layout in my head, the confirmation from someone who understood the same rules, and I realized that I was no longer operating in isolation, not in the sense of needing help, but in the sense that the system itself was now fully understood from multiple angles. There were no blind spots left, no assumptions I had not checked, just a clear, consistent picture of what had happened and what the system would do next under the right conditions. I walked back to the window and looked out at the neighborhood again. The same quiet street, the same steady lights, everything appearing stable on the surface. And I could not help but notice how unaware it all was, how easily people trust systems they never think about, how quickly they assume stability will continue simply because it always has. And that was the final piece, not anger, not frustration, but clarity, because what Maggie had done was not just interfere with my house. She had interfered with a system she did not understand. And once you understand a system completely, you do not need to force anything. You just need to let it respond exactly the way it was designed to, under the right conditions, at the right time, and everything else follows. The plan came together the way all good systems do, not in a rush, but in layers, each step connected to the next with nothing left to chance. I spent the rest of the day preparing, not acting, because timing was everything. The forecast continued to drop, the next cold front moving in faster than expected, temperatures projected to hit -20 degrees overnight, sustained wind making it feel even colder. The kind of conditions where demand spikes across the entire network, every furnace running longer, every regulator working harder to maintain balance. And that was exactly when the system would be most sensitive, not fragile, but responsive. I sat at my desk with the layout in front of me again, tracing the main distribution loop one more time, confirming what I already knew. The node near the east corner of the development was the key, not because it controlled everything, but because it influenced enough of the network to create a measurable shift without crossing into failure. That distinction mattered, This was never about breaking the system. It was about demonstrating it. I checked the county regulations again, not for permission, but for boundaries, making sure every action I considered remained within operational allowances, emergency adjustments, pressure balancing, system protection protocols, all written in language that assumed qualified handling, not misuse. And that was the difference. I was not stepping outside the system. I was using it. Exactly the way it was designed to respond under stress. I set up my documentation next. Camera positioned at the window with a clear view of the street. Another device ready to capture real-time readings from my own system. Timestamps synchronized, everything aligned. Because if this unfolded the way I expected, clarity would matter more than anything else afterward. I even drafted a formal notice. Not sent, not yet, but ready, outlining the sequence of events, the unauthorized interference, the resulting system response, all written in precise language that left no room for interpretation. Then I waited, not idly, but attentively, watching the temperature fall hour by hour, feeling the shift in the air as the cold deepened again. The kind of cold that changes how everything behaves. Metal contracts further, pressure lines tighten, demand increases across every connected point, and as night settled in, the neighborhood lights came on one by one, each house drawing from the same network, each system relying on the same balance to keep things stable. I stepped outside just after midnight, the air sharper than the night before, colder, heavier, my breath freezing faster as I exhaled, and I walked toward the regulator node I had identified earlier, boots steady on the frozen ground. Every movement deliberate, not rushed, not uncertain. I crouched down beside the housing, brushed away the thin layer of frost again, and paused for a second, not because I hesitated, but because I understood exactly what came next. This was the point where knowledge turns into action, where theory becomes reality, and once it started, the system would respond the only way it knew how. I made the adjustment carefully, precisely within the allowed range. Nothing excessive, nothing outside normal. Operational parameters, just enough to shift the balance at a time when the network was already under maximum demand. And then I stepped back, closed the panel, and walked away without looking back immediately. Because systems do not react instantly. They adjust, they compensate, they redistribute load across connected nodes, and it takes a few minutes for the effect to move through the network. I reached my driveway and turned just enough to see the street, quiet at first, unchanged, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the first signs appeared, not dramatic, not chaotic, but subtle shifts, the kind you only notice if you know what you are looking for. Lights flickering in a few houses, then steady again, systems recalibrating, pressure redistributing, and I stood there in the cold, watching it unfold exactly as expected, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity. Because this was not about causing a reaction. This was about revealing one, showing exactly how interconnected everything was, and how a single assumption, made by someone who did not understand the system, could ripple outward in ways they never anticipated. And as the minutes passed, I knew this was only the beginning of what the system was about to demonstrate. At first, nothing dramatic happened, and that was exactly what I expected, because systems like this do not announce themselves. They shift quietly until the effect becomes impossible to ignore. I stood there in the cold, watching the street, the air sharp enough to sting my eyes, and the first real sign came not from sound, but from rhythm, the subtle change in how the neighborhood breathed, furnaces cycling longer, then shorter, then struggling to stabilize as pressure recalibrated across the loop. One house flickered again, then another, not power, but the reflection of systems adjusting inside, and I could almost map it in real time. The redistribution moving from the east node outward, pushing demand into neighboring lines, forcing regulators to compensate within their limits, and under normal conditions, no one would notice. But this was not normal. This was peak demand in extreme cold, where every adjustment carries weight, where even small shifts stretch the system just enough to be felt. I stepped back into my house and closed the door behind me, the warmth steady, controlled, my system balanced because I had designed it that way, reinforced it beyond standard requirements. And that contrast mattered, because what I was watching outside was not failure, it was exposure. The system revealing its structure through response. My phone buzzed on the counter, the first notification lighting up the screen. A community group message, short, confused, someone asking if anyone else was having heating issues, followed quickly by another, then another, each one adding a piece to the pattern. Inconsistent heat, pressure drops, furnaces restarting, nothing catastrophic, nothing broken, but enough to disrupt, enough to force attention, and I did not respond. I just watched, because this was not the moment for words. This was the moment for the system to speak for itself. Within minutes, the messages shifted tone, confusion turning into concern, people stepping outside, checking meters, looking for explanations in the cold air that offered none, because the system was still operating within its parameters, still delivering, just not evenly, not predictably. And that unpredictability is what breaks the illusion of control. I moved to the window again and saw more lights turning on than before, not because it was darker, but because people were awake now, aware, reacting, and then I saw it. The white SUV pulling out onto the street, headlights cutting through the cold air, moving faster than usual, deliberate, searching. Maggie. Even from a distance I could recognize the way she drove, controlled but urgent, like someone trying to regain ground they did not realize they had lost. She stopped near the regulator. Point down the block, stepped out, coat pulled tight against the cold, and even from where I stood I could see the shift in her posture. The way she looked around, not with authority, but with uncertainty, because this was not something she could manage with a letter or a meeting. This was the system responding in ways she did not understand. My phone buzzed again. More messages. Someone mentioning calling the gas company. Someone else saying they had already tried. No outages reported. No service disruptions, which meant exactly what it needed to mean. The system was intact, functioning, just under stress, just reacting to internal balance changes. And there was nothing external for them to point to, nothing they could easily blame. I stayed where I was, watching, listening, feeling the steady warmth of my own house against the cold pressing outside. And for the first time since this started, the difference between understanding and assumption was fully visible. Maggie had believed she could isolate one house, control one outcome without consequence. But what she was seeing now was the opposite, a system that does not isolate, that does not respond to authority, only to input and conditions. And as more lights flickered, more messages came in, more people stepped outside into the freezing air trying to make sense of something they could not see. I realized the moment had arrived, not as a confrontation, not as a statement, but as a demonstration, because nothing I could have said would have been clearer than what the system was already showing. And once a system reveals itself like this, there is no going back to assumptions, no returning to the illusion of control, only the reality of how it actually works. By the time the second hour passed, the confusion outside had turned into something heavier, something harder to ignore, because patterns had started to form, and once people see a pattern, they stop guessing and start questioning. The messages on my phone were no longer scattered. They were consistent now. Entire sections of the neighborhood reporting the same thing: unstable heat, systems struggling to maintain temperature, furnaces cycling harder than usual, and the cold was not letting up. The air outside had that deep, cutting stillness that comes when the temperature drops far enough that even the wind seems to hesitate, and that is when pressure systems feel it the most, not in one place, but everywhere at once. I watched from the window as more people stepped out into their driveways, bundled in heavy coats, breath clouding the air, looking at meters they did not understand, checking panels that would never show the real issue, because the problem was not visible from where they stood. It was embedded in the system itself. And that is what made it impossible to explain away. Maggie's SUV was no longer parked calmly near the regulator. It was moving again, slower now, stopping at different points, her stepping out repeatedly, checking, looking, trying to find something she could control, something she could point to. But every time she moved, the pattern followed her, not tied to a single location, not fixed, just present across the network. And that was the moment the illusion fully broke, because there was no single failure to fix, no simple action to reverse what was happening, only a system responding exactly as it was designed to under the conditions it had been given. My phone buzzed again, but this time it was not the group chat. It was a direct call, her name on the screen, clear, immediate, and I let it ring once, twice, before answering, not out of hesitation, but because timing matters even in conversation. Her voice came through tight, controlled, but no longer steady. Asking if I had noticed any issues with my heating, and I answered honestly, calm, direct, no hesitation, I told her. My system was stable, fully operational, no interruptions, and there was a pause on her end, longer this time, because that answer did not fit into the explanation she was trying to build. She shifted quickly, asking if I had done anything, if I had made any adjustments, and I kept my response precise. I told her I had ensured my system was operating within optimal parameters, nothing more, nothing less. And that was when the tone changed, not aggressive, not yet, but strained, because she was starting to understand that whatever was happening, it was not random, and it was not something she could manage the way she managed everything else. She mentioned safety, responsibility, the need to maintain stability across the community, and I listened, letting her speak, because those words sounded different now, coming from someone who had just interfered with the same system she was now trying to stabilize. And when she finished, I responded with the same clarity I had used all along. I reminded her of the notice she sent, the language about temporary adjustments, about safety measures, and I asked a simple question, whether those measures were still in effect. There was another pause, shorter this time, sharper, because now the conversation had shifted, not into accusation, but into alignment, cause and effect laid side by side, and she could hear it, even if she did not want to acknowledge it directly. Outside, more lights flickered, more doors opened, the neighborhood fully awake now, fully aware that something was not right, and as I stood there, the warmth of my house steady around me, the system inside stable, controlled, I realized this was the point where everything turned, not because of what I said, not because of what she said, but because the system had already made the argument. It had shown exactly how interconnected everything was, exactly how control works when it is misunderstood, and there was no version of this where that could be undone, because once a system reveals its structure, once people feel it, see it, experience it, the illusion does not come back, only the reality remains. The call ended without a resolution, but it did not need one, because the resolution was already unfolding outside, in real time, in a way no conversation could control or contain. I stood there for a moment after the line went quiet, the phone still in my hand, listening not to voices anymore, but to the subtle rhythm of the system around me, the steady, controlled hum inside my house, the uneven, strained pattern beyond the walls, and that contrast said everything that needed to be said. I moved back toward the window and looked out again, the street fully alive now despite the hour, people standing in small clusters, talking, pointing, trying to piece together what they were experiencing, and for the first time since this began, the focus was not on rules or notices or compliance. It was on reality, on the simple fact that something in their environment was not behaving the way it was supposed to, and that realization spreads faster than any message, faster than any directive, because it is felt, not explained. Maggie's SUV was still moving, but slower now. Her stops shorter, more deliberate, as if she was no longer searching for control, but trying to understand something she could not immediately fix. And that shift mattered, because once control becomes uncertainty, everything that depends on it starts to loosen. My phone buzzed again, but the tone had changed completely. The group messages were no longer questions, they were observations, people comparing notes, noticing patterns, realizing that this was not isolated to one house or one line. And with that realization came something else, awareness, the kind that does not fade once it sets in. I waited a few more minutes, long enough for the system to fully express itself, long enough for the pattern to be undeniable, and then I stepped outside again, the cold still sharp, still demanding, but now it felt different, not like a threat, but like a condition the system was responding to. I walked back toward the regulator node, the same path as before, boots steady on the frozen ground. And I made the adjustment again, just as carefully, just as precisely, returning the balance to where it had been. Nothing abrupt, nothing forced, just a controlled correction within the same parameters I had used before. And then I stepped back, closed the panel, and walked away, giving the system time to respond, because it always does. And within minutes, the pattern outside began to shift again. The flickering settled, the cycles smoothed out, the uneven strain fading back into stability. One house at a time, one line at a time, until the neighborhood returned to the quiet, steady rhythm it had before. But it was not the same quiet. Not anymore. Because now everyone had felt the difference. Everyone had seen what happens when the system is pushed in ways they do not understand. I reached my driveway and paused for a moment, looking back at the street. The lights steady now. The movement slowing as people returned inside. And I knew this part was over, not because anything had been said, but because everything had been shown. I went back inside and set the phone on the counter, the house warm, stable, exactly the way it was designed to be. And I looked at the folders still sitting on the desk, the evidence, the records, the clear line between what had been done and how the system had responded. And I understood that what came next would not need to be loud. It would not need to be dramatic, because the truth was already established, the boundaries already exposed. And as I stood there, listening to the steady hum of the system running exactly as it should, one thought settled in with complete clarity. They believed control was something you could claim, something you could enforce with rules and authority. But what they learned, what everyone out there felt, was something very different. Control is not loud. It is not visible. It is built into the system itself. And once you understand it, once you see how everything connects, how everything responds, it becomes something else entirely, something precise, something patient, something inevitable. And that is the kind of control no one can take away once it is proven.